My name is Frayne Olson. I'm a crop economist and marketing specialist with NDSU Extension. Here's my contact information. So if you do have any questions or anything that comes up later on, please feel free to contact me. Email is probably the most reliable. I will try and get back to you as soon as I can, I promise. So we're going to go through dry bean outlook today. And I just want to provide a kind of big picture overview of what happened to dry bean production here in North Dakota, but then also what happened nationally. So we had a much better year, not only for planted acreage, but also for yields. So when we compare 23 to 24, we had in 2024 now, we had 13.2 million hundredweight of dry beans. Now this is all classes of dry beans together. That's about a 48% increase from 2023. But again, if you remember right, 2023 was a relatively low year. We had lower planted acreage, as well as we had some issues across the state. So much better year in 24 within the state of North Dakota. When we look nationally, a very similar thing happened. 2024, we had 31.3 million hundredweight of all dry beans produced, all classes. That's up about 31% from 2023. So again, a very good year at the national level. We had a recovery and a rebound. So let's dive a little bit deeper, look specifically at pinto beans. Pinto beans is a very dominant crop we have, dryable bean class that we have here in North Dakota. When we look at pinto bean planted acreage, so the area planted, the gold portion of these bars is the North Dakota acreage. The green bars are the other acres. So North Dakota is very dominant, about 70 to 75% of the total acreage planted is in this region. Again, dominant class for us. We're really number one in the nation. And as you can see, we had a recovery in planted acreage. Prices had come up a little bit. Some of the contracting programs were a bit more aggressive to make sure that we had enough acreage planted this year because our inventories were pretty tight coming to this last spring. When we look at total production, very similar story. Yields were good, not only here in North Dakota, but also nationally, with Nebraska being really our number 2 state for pinto bean production. So North Dakota and Nebraska are the 2 dominant regions. Both of those areas had better production. Now, this isn't record production for pinto beans nationally, but it's getting very close. So we had a very good year. We're not only able to refill the pipeline, but we've got some pretty good inventories now coming into the 2025 season. And that obviously is having some impact on pricing and forward pricing decisions. So when we look at the consumption, we have some pretty good idea what the production numbers are right now. The big concern now moving forward is what about the consumption rates, and then potentially what happens in the 2025 cropping year. So just for a simple breakdown, approximately 65 to 75% of the pinto beans are used domestically. Okay, so they stay within the country. They're used for canning, for restaurant or what's called institutional use, which would be restaurants, or it could be hospitals as well as school systems. Some of that's in cans, some of it's bagged, some of it's processed. There's a lot of different uses domestically. Now, the one thing to understand is whether we're talking about pinto beans or navy beans or corn or soybeans or wheat, our domestic markets tend to be relatively stable, which is very good because it's nice to have that really good stable use or base for our consumption. And right now, again, the markets from a domestic standpoint are relatively stable, relatively steady. So there isn't a lot of uncertainty. There isn't a lot of big shifts, changes. For example, back when we had the COVID years, there was a sudden change in demand. We had this shifting of people's eating habits. They didn't eat as much out in the restaurants. They were preparing more things at home, and dry beans was one of those that actually had a pretty big surge in consumption. Well, we're now back to kind of regular, normal market conditions. So again, domestic market is very big. It's very dominant. We need that market, but there just isn't a lot of uncertainty or variability in it. It tends to be one of those nice, stable markets. In contrast, the international market or exports are much more unpredictable. They're much more unstable as far as not only quantities, but also the qualities that are desired. Usually in the U.S., we like a number 1 bean. Some of these international markets would prefer a number one, but there are some that will take a number two or a number three. They'll have some discolorations depending upon what they want to use it for. Is it going to be used for whole beans as a side dish, or is it going to be processed into something like a refried bean product? Okay, so Mexico is our number one buyer, and I'll show you some numbers in just a few moments. Mexico is again our kind of the country that provides a lot of instability, if you will. So there are years, as you'll see, where the Mexican market is very large. Last year, we had some very, very good export sales into the Mexican markets, primarily because Mexico had some production problems. But right now, today, when we look at our export levels so far this marketing year, basically returned to more normal levels. So last year, a big crop, a short crop in Mexico, a relatively short crop in the United States, a big surge in export volumes. Now those volumes are returning back to more normal. So even though Mexico is still our number one customer, their volumes have dropped. And there's an additional kind of yellow flag starting to show up, and that has to do with the trade issues between the US and Mexico. Now, currently, the trade tensions are still there. The Mexican market has slowed significantly. I think there were some pretty good export sales earlier on in the season. I think some of the major Mexican buyers were buying ahead a little bit, just as kind of a hedge or protection against any kind of trade issues that might appear. We got very close to having some problems show up, but at the last minute, there was basically a delay for about 30 days for any kind of tariffs or retaliatory tariffs that were going to be put on by the U.S. on Mexican products, and also Mexico that and then back on U.S. products. Now, we don't know specifically if dry beans or even agricultural products were part of the plan for the Mexican retaliation. They really were pretty vague on what they were going to do, and if there were going to be some retaliatory tariffs. Well, we didn't know exactly what products were going to be included. So just kind of this uncertainty and anxiety about these trade relationships, the Mexican exports into Mexico, or at least new purchases by Mexican companies, have slowed significantly. So that is starting to put a little bit of downward pressure on pinto bean prices. There's some, I know that there's some bean houses that pulled their bids for a while just because of that uncertainty. They didn't necessarily want to come in and have to buy a lot of farmer-based selling and then sit on those beans for a long time, not knowing when or if they'd be able to reship them. So if we look specifically historically, and I need to explain this graphic just a little bit, on the four columns on the left-hand side are the calendar, these are the marketing year totals. So this would be the marketing year that starts on August 1 and runs through the end of, starts on September 1, runs through the end of August. So the marketing year for pinto beans and navy beans starts on September 1. Moral of the story is, we've had the historically 4 columns on the left-hand side, 12-month totals. We've had some volatility, in particular in the Mexican market. It usually ranks number one as our buyer. Last year, the 23-24 marketing year was substantial increase from the previous numbers we had seen. Dominican Republic is also a major buyer. Now, the challenge we have in the Dominican Republic is because of their economic status and their ability to buy off the global market, they tend to have lower volumes, and often there's some kind of either trade assistance that goes with that or some kind of financing assistance. So that both the Dominican Republic and Haiti tend to be a bit more variable just because the country isn't quite as wealthy. Okay, now, but again, I want to emphasize these are very good customers of ours, and I'm not trying to cause any problems or any kind of issues. Then we do send some into Spain and El Salvador, and then there's a list of some smaller countries that come in and buy smaller amounts. So if we look at the very bottom line, again, 4 columns on the far left-hand total are 12-month totals. 2023-24 was a very, very good export year. Now, the 2 columns on the right-hand side, the far right-hand column is the year-to-date. So this would be from essentially September 1 through November, through the end of November. Again, the information we get out of both USDA and Department of Commerce is a little bit delayed. especially for some of these specialty crops. So I know this isn't very far into the marketing year, but it does give a general signal on how we're doing. And then the column right next to it on the left would be for the same time period last year. So we can compare our year-to-date totals this year versus last year. And you notice bottom line numbers, let me get my note here. Bottom line numbers, we are down pretty substantially. But when we look historically, these are pretty normal numbers. Whereas again, last year was a very aggressive year. We're coming back to levels that are more typical. Same thing then for Mexico. When we look at the current export pace into the Mexican market, that's more like a normal year. More, we do get variability, obviously, but that's more typical to what we typically see. Again, same thing for Dominican Republic and for Haiti. So even though we're having a good export season so far, I would not call this as a great export season, and definitely down from last year. And again, the biggest kind of cloud on the horizon right now is what's going to happen with the trade issues between the United States and Mexico. Now, I did want to include this. I've included this for the last couple of years. I do want to give credit to StatPub, which is a company out of Canada that does a very good job of following what's happening in particular in the pulse market, dryable beans, other pulses like field peas and lentils. I did want to give them credit for this. I don't want to put a lot of pressure on the numbers here. These are private estimates. But it does give a general idea of what the trends are. Okay, and we look at total acreage as well as total production. Now the production numbers are going to be in metric ton. Total production numbers, have been bouncing around. Big recovery last year in our production. When we look at total supplies, our total available supplies are up. Some of that is because of the beginning stocks numbers, and some of it is because of the production numbers. Also notice that the domestic consumption tends to be relatively stable. It does bounce around from year to year, but it tends to be relatively stable. But our exports are the numbers that jump around considerably. So I just want to drop to the ending stocks. Again, I don't want to put a tremendous amount of pressure on this because I don't understand the full methodology that this company is using to come up with their estimates. But it is an indicator. It's one of those things that I do look at and try and give me a general idea of what's happening. And when you look at forecast for ending stocks, if we look at kind of typical domestic use, we look at a drop or a cutback in our export levels. Given the fact that we had these very large production numbers, it looks as though our ending stocks are going to increase and increase pretty substantially. So what does that mean for pricing moving forward? When we look at our historical price movement, so let me explain this very quickly. The red line, these are weekly prices, weekly average prices reported by USDA AMS, the Ag Marketing Service. So the red line running through the middle right here is this current marketing year. So notice it starts September 1 and runs through the beginning of February. Now, the bright blue line is the prices we saw last year. The purple line is from 2 years ago, and you can see the different colors going back in time. So we've had prices that were much, much higher than we see today. For example, in that 21, 22 time period, which is up in this brown, but we've seen some much, much lower prices like we saw in 2017 and 18 down here. So we're kind of in the middle of the range. As I noted, there's a slight drop off in some of the spot market prices we're getting for pinto beans right now. And again, I do think that's a concern about potential additional sales into the Mexican market. So as we move forward, one of the things I'm looking at from this graphic is to say, when do we typically get additional price movements? This winter time season tends to be relatively flat, relatively stable. We don't get a lot of price movements normally or typically this time of year. But by the time we get into spring planting, we do start to see a few years where we're having some small rallies. And that was usually because of some kind of planting problem. Either it was too wet or too dry, typically too wet, or it could be too dry. But there's some concern about planted acreage. And then later on, as we get into the growing season, some uncertainty or concerns about the actual size of the crop. So my suspicion as we move forward, we have kind of this cloud on the horizon with our trade with Mexico that may put some additional downward pressure, at least on old crop beans. I'm not saying that for new crop beans, but at least for old crop beans. But I really don't anticipate any kind of bouncing around or shifting or changing of kind of market psychology until we get into the growing season. And so if you're willing and able to try and store your beans into that time period, that's a choice you're going to have to make. There's cost of carry, but will there be enough kind of excitement about some pinto bean problems from a production standpoint to get a more of a lift in the markets? Again, we'll just have to wait to see what our summer brings. For new crop pricing, I'm going to stall off or delay my comments on new crop pricing for just a little bit until we get through the navy bean discussion. And I want to talk about the relationship with soybean and soybean prices. So let's move into the navy bean market and get an idea of what's happening there. Just kind of a quick summary and overview. When we look at planted area or planted acreage for navy beans, that's been downtrending for the last about 4 or 5 years. So we had a peak back in about 2020. And every year we've been taking these planted acreage down a little bit. So our number one production state is Michigan. North Dakota is typically number 2. And then Minnesota is typically number 3. Sometimes Minnesota and North Dakota kind of flip-flop back and forth for 2 and 3, depending upon our relative yields. But Michigan is typically our number one producing region. So when we look at planted acreage, the gold portion of those bars is the North Dakota area, and then the green is every other state. When we look at total production, again, this was not a great production year. So it wasn't because of yields. Yields came in pretty typical. Most of the reduction is because of the planted area or the planted acreage. So again, when we're looking at our supply and demand tables here in a few minutes, you're going to start to see that those ending stocks for navy beans are starting to dwindle down. They're starting to get a little bit tighter, which might have some implications as we move into the rest of the growing season. So similar to pinto beans, navy beans are still dominated by the domestic market. About 50 to 65% is domestic consumption, and about the other, 35 to 50% is international sales, again, depending upon the year and depending upon kind of price levels. So very similar to what I said before in the navy beans or in the pinto bean story. Navy beans, domestic use tends to be historically pretty stable, with the exception of what we saw during the COVID years. There was a kind of a shift in people's buying habits, but they've now returned to more of a normal situation. Domestic buying is relatively slow right now. This is kind of seasonally a pretty slow period. On the export front, the United Kingdom, UK, or Great Britain is typically our number one buyer, but it does vary a little bit. Italy has also, the last several years, become a very important sales buyer for U.S. navy beans, and of course Canada. Now, the one thing with Canada is a lot of the navy beans that Canada purchases, that cross the border into Canada, are really transshipped. They're produced here in the United States. They're contracted by Canadian companies, transshipped into the Canadian market, and from there goes on to either use within Canada or more than likely export sales into the European market. So export sales to Italy are similar to last year. And again, last year we had some very good export sales into the Italian market. Unfortunately, sales into the United Kingdom or Great Britain, as well as Canada, are lower. So some of the, our biggest buyer, Italy, is actually remaining very strong, but we're seeing some of the other large buyers start to drop off a little bit. I'm not really sure the reason for that. I think some of it is some international competition, but also just supply chains have started to shift. Now, one of the concerns we do have, even though it's not been in the forefront of the news, is the U.S. is also talking about potential tariffs on EU products, the European Union products. And so that could then turn around and provide some retaliatory tariffs from the European Union. And I know last time when we got into a trade dispute with the European Union, the dry bean market was one of those that had been targeted. And so European Union to put on, I believe is either a 25%, I believe it was 25% and later 50% import tariff on US beans. So we do have that, again, kind of hanging over the head of the marketplace right now. It's not something that is, has been announced. It's just one of those things as a rumor that's moving forward. The other comment I do want to make, though, is that UK, so the Great Britain, is not included in that. So from the United States standpoint, they're separating out what's going on in Great Britain from what's happening in the European Union. So European Union, which would include Italy, could be under some, could potentially move into a tariff concerns, but it doesn't sound like the UK or the Great Britain area will be included in that. When we look at export numbers, again, 4 columns on the far left-hand side are 12 months totals or the marketing year totals. The 2 columns on the right-hand side are year-to-date totals. So you can see as we look back at this, typically the United Kingdom or Great Britain is our #1 customer. Now, last year, Italy suddenly surged or increased to a point where they were #1. Now, when we look at today's levels, the export sales into UK are down, and down, I would consider pretty significantly. The numbers into Italy are still remaining pretty strong from a relative standpoint, from a historical standpoint. And then our export sales into Canada, or these transloading shipments into Canada, are also on a pretty good pace. Interesting to note that even for navy beans, Mexico is our #4 buyer. So there may be some spillover effects if we do get into a trade war or some kind of dispute with the Mexicans that may spill over a little bit into the navy bean market as well. So when we look at the bottom line numbers, our export sales last year for navies were very strong, very good export season. Again, helped us bring down some of those inventory levels. But this year we're a little bit behind that pace. Not a lot. I'm not saying I'm not raising a red flag or having major concerns, but it is something to be watching as we move forward. So if this stays on the same pace, we'll have an okay year, but it may not be quite as aggressive as last year. Again, I want to give StatPub their due credit for putting this information together. Again, it's something that I do follow and try and pay attention to. Once again, I don't want to lean too hard on these forecasts because I don't understand all of the kind of the assumptions they make in the background, but it is one of those reference points that I use to get an idea or an indication of what's happening. So when we look at not only the production numbers, we're looking at production across time. As my graphics showed earlier, the production was down pretty significantly this year. When we look at domestic consumption, because the production numbers were down, there isn't going to be as much available supplies. And so domestic use is forecast to drop a little bit. I do expect to see some of the export numbers to slip just a little bit simply because of the supply situation. Now, what that does mean is lower production. We are getting a drop in consumption, but those consumption levels were not as aggressive. The odds are we will tighten up the bottom line balance sheet, the bottom line ending stocks a little bit tighter on navy beans. So when we look at navy beans versus pintos, kind of an opposite thing happening. The navy bean ending stocks are tightening a little bit, adding a little bit more kind of nervousness in the marketplace. But on the pinto bean side, we're actually increasing our ending stocks, which provides a little bit of comfort level for the pinto market. When we look at what's happening again with price volatility or seasonal price patterns, once again, the red bar right here is where the average navy bean price is reported by USDA. Again, they do a pretty good job of surveying this. The blue line is where we were last year, and again, the purple line is where we were 2 years ago. So very, very quiet trade in the navy bean market. We really haven't seen a lot of pricing or price volatility. Looking at history, I do think we'll have to get basically into the growing season to see if there's any kind of potential production problems to give a lift into the old crop pricing. If that doesn't appear, we'll probably see these very, very similar levels. There might be some downward pressure again, depending upon what happens with our trade with the European Union. Okay, my last slide here, I do want to give some reference points here. Okay, so as we move into the new crop contracting season, we start thinking about new crop pricing. I have not heard of any real good quotes yet for new crop pinto or navy bean pricing. I think the industry is going to be a little bit cautious to wait to see how some of these trade issues play out. I do know they want to try and get some acres pre-priced, in particular if as farmers trying to get their financing put together and make some seed purchases. I would not be surprised that the pinto bean prices stay at these levels or slightly less. simply because of the building inventories. There can be a slight slippage in acreage and not really cause any major damage to the pricing or to the supply chains. So I do think the bean houses and end users will be a little bit cautious. They're going to probably start a little bit low within their pricing system to see if they can buy enough acres. And if that doesn't happen, you may see a slight bump or increase later on. So I think pricing for Pinots, especially for the new crop contracts, it's going to be a little challenging. I think you're going to be a little frustrated with some of those early numbers coming out. And then it's going to be up to you to say, well, is it worth locking in some prices? And that's really a risk management perspective from your standpoint. I don't have a lot of advice that would be good generalized advice for you. But just realize that if they don't get enough acreage pre-priced early on, you may see a slight increase later on as we get closer to spring planting. On the flip side, when we look at navies, the navy market, I think, may come out a little bit more aggressive than the Pinot market to try and make sure at a minimum that they hold their acreage from last year and hopefully increase by a little bit. Again, the supply-demand balance within navy beans is a little trickier. And again, we in this region, as far as navy beans, are usually number 2 or number 3 producers. So a lot of this is going to be driven by what happens in Michigan. And when we look at competing crops, I'm putting up the futures market for November soybeans. This was as of Friday, the 7th. So this is the close last week, Friday of last week. We were at about 10.50, between 10.50 and 10.60. Okay, we're in that kind of range right now for new crop soybeans. Soybeans tend to be that kind of flip acreage. If the hardcore Pinot and navy bean producers, they like to have some acreage, but they can flip some acres around, and soybeans tends to be that kind of competing crop. Now, soybeans has its own set of problems and issues in the marketplace right now, in particular in the global markets and the very large supply coming out of South America. But this is often used for farm managers as well as for those companies that are contracting as kind of that proxy, saying, well, what do we need to be? How do we price our contracts, our forward contracts, to be competitive with soybeans? And so as you're thinking about this and looking at the relative profitability of growing one of the either Pinots, navies, or blacks, obviously soybeans becomes that competing crop. And so what's happening in the soybean market has a pretty big influence on pre-crop or pre-plant pricing. Once the seed is in the ground, then those price correlations between prices in the navy, Pinot bean, and black bean market start to separate a little bit more from the soybeans, because the end use is very different. But we compete on the front end in the production area. So from a production standpoint and a crop budgeting standpoint, they have to be competitive. But once the seed is in the ground, then those prices tend to separate. It's much more about supply and demand within the relative markets. So I hope you found this valuable. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me and contact me. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great day.